Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nomsa, and I'm part of the marketing team here at the OR Society. We will shortly be starting the webinar with Hiroko. So we're just giving people a few minutes to join, but we should be starting shortly. Hello, hi, Hiroko, is that you?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
All right, perfect. I was just saying to the audience that we're just going to give a couple of minutes for a few more people to join, and then we'll get going.
Okay, a beautiful arrangement, so that they know when to ask questions and so on, or.
I'm going to do a proper introduction in the next few minutes. So I'll just give people just 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll get going. So I'll give everyone a bit of a talk on how we're going to structure today's webinar and how you can ask questions, etc. Just giving people a couple of minutes just to join.
Yep, makes sense.
Perfect. Okay, it doesn't seem like too many more people are joining now, so we're going to go ahead and make a start. As I said earlier, my name is Nomsa Swanda, and I'm part of the marketing team here at the OR Society. Today, we have the pleasure of having this webinar being presented by Hiroko Plant, who is the Regulatory Policy Committee Secretariat at Government Business, and she's gonna give us about an hour with her presentation, which you should see that first page of that presentation on your screens now. How we're gonna do this is Hiroko will go through the slides, and then after the slides, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the questions box here on GoToWebinar, and then I'll fire them over to Hiroko, and then she'll answer them as best she can.
Yeah, I'm afraid government doing our best with the technology that we have, but I'll try to remember to stop and ask for questions at the end of each slide. So, hello, I'm Hiroko Plant. As Nomsa said, I'm the head of Secretariat for the Regulatory Policy Committee, but I guess more relevantly, I've had a nearly 20-year career in government OR, and I'm really interested in how we can support ministerial decision-making better, and wind tunnelling is one of the approaches to supporting decision-making better. I think that can work really well. And I should say can work really well. I think it's one of the many soft OR approaches with relatively limited applications for various practical reasons that we'll go into. So it's not the solution to everything, but it's the solution in a sort of niche place. So why might we want to do policy wind tunnelling? Can we have the next slide, please, Nomsa?
Yes. Perfect.
Policy, so over the last 20 years, policy has been delivered more and more at pace. So the amount of time that people have to put into thinking about and revisiting policy gets smaller and smaller. It's almost always developed in a particular context, and often quite a specific context, because it's driven by political, societal, physical changes that people are kind of anchored upon. And policymakers are human beings. Behaviourally, they do anchor on what they know, what they expect, what they feel to be the things that are going on now. And then, of course, the world changes, but ministers of all people have a really strong need to not discover that their policy isn't working as they intended at just the wrong moment. And that's equally true for the poor souls who are on the receiving end of the policy, especially on the operational delivery end. So, important bits of policy making looking at how your policy might operate in fields that you haven't got at the moment but might have in the medium term is really important and really useful. And it's also important in terms of developing really good monitoring and evaluation. If you can think about what might be good indicators of something going horribly wrong with your policy, or even slightly wrong with your policy, then you're much more likely to be able to monitor it effectively and to drive it, to change it in real time, as you need to do in order to avoid the sort of horrifying surprises. And I put the usual OR caveat, in fact. All models are wrong, some models are useful, and the same is true. Approaches. This won't tell anyone what's going to go wrong with their policy. It won't tell anyone what worlds are actually going to eventuate. What it will help them do is challenge the policy to make it more robust to unexpected or reasonably expectable outside influences. So if I stop there, are there any questions?
Do we have any questions? So please feel free to type them up in the chat box. If not, we will move on. So I'm just going to wait a few seconds just to see if there's anything that comes up. Nope, nothing as yet. So we'll just move on to the next slide.
Okay, so carrying on, this is an important and a useful thing to be able to do. It's also quite an expensive thing to do. In order to do the kinds of things that I'm about to propose to you, you need to be able to draw on a reasonably wide range of senior stakeholders, and you probably need at least a half a day of their time and maybe more. And that's a significant commitment in policy world, it really is. And it's also labour intensive for the OR folk who have to set this stuff up. So you put quite a bit of time and effort into building packages of horizon scans and information for people, and you put quite a lot of time and effort into thinking about leading indicators and risk management and mitigation later on. So it's really only worth applying in areas where you're going to get enough bang for your buck to make that worthwhile. And those are usually areas where senior folk and or ministers are especially risk averse, or where there are serious, really serious real world impacts, or where there's a huge level of commitment to the strategy so that it has to be made to work no matter what. The throwaway note there is, if there's a huge level of commitment, it may well be the case that you'll find it harder to get buy-in to the idea of challenging the approach at all. And it's only worth doing, even if all of those things are true, if it's also the case that there's a reasonable amount of uncertainty about the future. Now, that's normally the case. I can't think of very many examples in government where it's not. But it's worth just bringing that one out as well. In the Home Office's remit, in things like counter-terrorism, serious organised crime, drugs, where the outcomes are quite uncertain, partly determined by other people, relatively expensive, both politically and personally, and where in general the Home Office sees itself very much as a risk management and a risk-averse department, so it puts more time and effort into thinking about managing risk in that kind of way. I've seen a bit more in DH, but I've not done those myself, so I'm going to talk about them less. And then the last thing is, this does have time constraints attached to it. It takes a while to get people's heads around it and to build all the things you need to build. So it's quite hard to deliver effectively in 2 days flat. We thought quite seriously in days recently about applying some of this thinking to bits of the industrial strategy, and in the end we decided we couldn't, because the amount of time we'd need to do it properly meant that it really wasn't possible to deliver something worth having in the time allowed. So second slide. Any questions so far? I've tried to talk to you about why we might want to do it and when we might want to do it.
No, we don't have any questions as yet.
Okay.
So we're going to move to the next slide.
Going at pace here. Excellent. Okay. So how we do it, the basic idea, before I go into all the detail I put in the slides, is that what you're doing is getting policymakers to tell themselves stories about how the world might be and about how their policy might act in the world of the story. And the stories that they're telling based on futures thinking about the drivers that most affect their policies. So you need to start with a bunch of futures thinking. You need to start with really quite a lot of prep, pulling together horizon scan materials in your area. I don't think I've ever seen anybody do one of these with a custom horizon scan. This is one of these places where government is a massive free rider. And that's mainly because it's too expensive to do and too slow. And if you do it quick and mucky, it's not nearly systematic enough to be useful. So there's a bunch of usual suspects out there that we draw on. And the Cabinet Office website has a truly excellent set of links that one can draw upon. But yeah, the first thing, pull together horizon scans, think about what the future trends in things that might be key drivers for the policy that you're playing with are. Then you really, really need the right collection of people. You need a range of views, of expertise, of experience, of people who are willing to think about how the future might be in different ways and able to think about how the future might be in different ways. And it helps if there's some tension between some of the people present, because that helps you to avoid groupthink. And this is a challenge process. One of the things that's really important is avoiding groupthink as much as possible. You need to pull together really quite a bit of facilitator support, especially if you want to do in a day or half a day flat. You're going to need people to be typing up while the participants are thinking, and you're going to need to be able to feed back to the participants in a fairly organised way fairly quickly. And you need some decent rules of engagement, which means having facilitators who are able to handle the fact that this is a challenge process, and that just saying, well, that would never happen under our policy is not a sensible thing to go with. And you need to think about exactly how people can bring their experiences in a way that's helpful and informative without feeling under pressure to do something they're not comfortable with. And the standard set of rules there is Chatham House, of course. So that's that set. Anything on prep and getting the thing together before I move on again?
No, don't have any questions as yet.
Okay, cool.
So we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so if we move on, I have lost a slide, I think, or put it in the wrong place. Can you go down 2, Nomsa, instead of 1? I need slide 6 now.
Yep. Is the
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
How workshop should be the header. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, so this is a sort of central piece of a wind tunneling system, and the idea is that you're going to get people to agree what the key drivers for things that might their policy go off course are, that have some bearing, some backing in the real world from the horizon scans. So things where we think there's a reasonable probability that those changes are actually going to happen as well. And then you're going to get them to build these fictional worlds. You can't do very many, and that's a real constraint on this process. If you're working with 4 or 5 or 6 drivers that might be really important, then you need to think of a way of cutting it down, either by not exploring all the combinations, or by prioritizing, or by taking some other approach entirely. Maybe red teaming would work better there. because if you have two axes and you have a high and a low along them, that gives you 4-story worlds. If you have 3, that gives you 8, and so on. It's exponential. And that means in turn that the amount of time you have to buy from your participants approach you can use for this, and I don't propose to teach you all this, okay? Most in the past is just getting people to write on post-it notes and then cluster them. The really important thing is to keep going round that loop until the participants are pretty happy, because everything else builds on those drivers. If you haven't got those in a place where participants will accept them, then the rest of the process kind of breaks down at that point. So you set out you figure out what your axes are. Can we just have slide 7 for a moment? I'm going to duck into an example here.
Yep.
Okay, so this is an example. It's sort of fairly heavily fictionalized, but it's an example from a workshop I did around cybercrime quite a while ago. And the 2 axes that the participants came up, the speed of development of technology, so how fast does the tech develop away from beyond where we are today, and the amount of trust within society in general. So do people trust one another? Do they leave their doors open? Do they, or at the other end of the scale, do they break down into sort of small bubble groups who don't trust anyone except their immediate contacts and the people who have the same views as them? And it's important to note on the technology axis, the bottom, the little arrow at the bottom is basically zero change. So when we were thinking about this, we were thinking about no change away from the present day rather than negative change. We weren't imagining that technology would collapse in some way. And that again is quite important. You have to get people clear on, when we're thinking about high and low, what do we really mean about that before you can move on to getting them to describe it. Thank you. So can I go back to slide 6?
Yeah.
So we've got 2 key drivers. In my case, they were in that particular case, technology and trust. And then 4 possible worlds. So in this case, it's high technology, high trust, high technology, low trust, low technology, high trust, low technology, low trust. And you need to get your groups to think about what those worlds would look like. And quite often, drawing on fiction or pop culture gives people references common that mean that they can build a picture quite fast, which so it's useful to get names fairly quickly, and it's useful to get names that are based in something that the participants can get quite a rich picture from in common. Usually I've broken the group out into smaller groups to take 1 world each, just because it saves time. There's no reason why you couldn't use the whole group. And one uses facilitators to scribe so that you can create the stories and feed them back to the group quickly. Again, if you wanted to just create the stories and then bring people back at a later date, that would be possible, but all of it eats more time. And the other thing that's useful besides drawing on pop cultural references to get people in a common place is to get them thinking about prompts. So in the past, we've created fictional characters and got people to talk through a day in the life of that character in this world, or to think about red teaming in the case of very oppositional things like counterterrorism. If we were in this world and you were the bad guys, what would they do? Those kinds of questions are quite useful to kind of push people to think about it in the right sort of way. So again, that's one reason why there's quite a lot of pre-prep involved. Having those materials and giving them to people to draw on is really quite important. And you need to give them time to do all of that.
Okay, great. We actually have a couple of questions now. The first one's from Ian Mitchell, and he asks, how do you get participation by the necessary stakeholders? Are there any approaches that you would recommend?
Honestly, beyond the blindingly obvious, I think the only thing that one can do is to say very explicitly to whoever actually wants this done, if these people can't participate, it may well not be worth wasting people's time over. So my sort of take has been, if you can't do it, it's better to cut dates than to try to drag in the right people in the right place. Policy colleagues are, of course, better at influencing their immediate stakeholders than me in many cases, and I draw shamelessly on that skill set. And making it sound fun is really important. So talking to people about what they're going to be doing in a way that feels fun and engaging, but also bring or what they're going to get out of it. Why they ought to come and contribute, because if they don't, their view won't be taken into account, is always an exciting one. Is that okay, Ian?
Okay, perfect. Yep, it says that was quite helpful. We've got another question from Chris Allen, and he asks, what size of workshop is workable? Is there an optimum number of people that you would recommend?
So it depends a little bit on what your stakeholder community is and what the answer to the breadth of stakeholders question is. I've worked it with 24, 25 people in the room and 6 facilitators, and I'm not sure I'd want to do any more than that, just because of the sheer complexity of rushing around trying to align them all and make sure that everybody's doing as they ought. And also because actually getting 6 skilled facilitators together for half a day is a non-trivial exercise in its own right. On the other end, really the minimum number of people you want kind of prodding each other to try to create a story is about 3 or 4. So if you haven't got at least that number in the room, it's probably not worth everybody's time anyway. And if you hadn't, I'd be questioning whether you'd got the right breadth of stakeholders and so on. It's not really something you ought to be running with just one human being, because the whole point of it is to challenge groupthink, and in particular to push people away from thinking that the world is always going to be like the one they've got in their heads. Is that okay?
Yeah, great. Chris says that makes sense. And we've got one more question from Ian Mitchell saying, what is red teaming?
Oh, sorry. So red teaming is exactly what it sounds like. It's another soft OR approach, which I know lots of colleagues have used elsewhere. And it's getting it's in effect setting up a game where one group of your policy colleagues will play the adversary. So it works really well in the kind of home office-y situations where you've got an obvious specific adversary, but it's asking people to try to break your policy on purpose, to try to game the system and break it in ways that you wouldn't have thought of by yourself. There are quite a lot of good books on it. DSTL have quite a few, I know, which happy to send some emails around after if that would help.
Yeah, great. No, that would be great. Thank you to Chris and Ian for both those questions, or those 3 questions rather. Would you want me to move back to the post?
So can I have slide 8? Yeah.
Oh, in slide 8. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm bouncing around here. It's because I put the example in.
So are we on the leading indicator slide?
Sorry.
Are we on the leading indicator slide now?
I'm on. It's an example slide, and it should have the same crisscross thing that we had before.
Perfect.
With some words in the boxes now.
Yes, I think we're on there now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, cool. So this is the example of the worlds that people created, and these are not the pop culture references they gave me exactly again, but they're examples of the kinds of things. So in a high-tech, low-trust world, the thing that everybody had in their mind was Blade Runner or The Matrix. Nobody really trusts anybody else, but the tech's all over the place. Those of you who are into science fiction might also think about William Gibson and Neuromancer, that kind of world. And that was quite evocative for my participants at the time and brought out quite a lot of good insights into what sorts of things they might do. In the high-tech, high-trust world, they saw themselves as being in the world of an Apple advert. Everything works, everything's nice, all the time. Our technology will help us to do all the cool things with our family whom we love and trust, that kind of flavour. And again, thinking about it gave them a common current. Low-tech, low-trust was Balamory. And that was, low-tech, high-trust was Balamory. Everybody knows everybody. Nobody locks their doors. It's a nice country sort of place, but actually we're not really, the tech's not moved on much. And then the last one, actually, I think threw participants off a bit, and I've chucked it in as this is again not quite the line that they used, but it had that kind of flavour. And I've chucked it in as an example of where one might want to push back a bit and think I didn't push back enough on the kinds of names that people give, and really get people to be sure that what they're expressing is what they feel is right in terms of the two ends of the spectrum. So we ended up with something that was a bit like Gin Lane, and certainly the image, I think Dickensian, the image in people's minds was much lower tech than anything that we see in the modern day, even in, quite deprived bits of the first world societies. And that very slightly later on led us down a couple of slightly odd paths that we had to resile from a bit, I think. And so I think in retrospect, I would have done that one different. You get what you get. So if we can go back to again, my workshop.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, yes, carry on.
Yes, we're on the workshop slide now.
Thank you. So, we've got our worlds, we've got this is what we're going to be like. It's quite important to get everybody to buy in. So there's a step that probably I should have added explicitly to the slides, which is bringing all that back into plenary and getting people to talk it through and sort of get to know the worlds a little bit. And then the next thing is obviously exploring policy implications. So we've got these worlds, we've got our policy, our strategy, our thing that we intend to do. If we do it in these worlds, what is going to happen? And again, there are loads of structured approaches that one can use for this. Soft OR is, a minefield of possibilities, but you could think about running through the good old pestle. You could think about what are all the best things, what are all the worst things, what are the talking through the days in the life again and how those might bite on our various individuals. Whatever works best for your policy and your people. And I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want, I suppose, to try to constrain you over much in there. And then what you do is you cut out the worlds that you don't care very much about. So if you're lucky, and again, I haven't done some of these worlds.
Sorry,
everything
Hiroko,
will be cool.
We lost you there for a few seconds. Do you mind just starting again on that sentence?
Oh, sure. So, and I've not been in a workshop yet where I haven't been, but I dare say one will come. You're getting at least some worlds where everything is absolutely perfect for your policy. It works even better than you intended. It's the best thing since sliced cheese. It's the world the minister was thinking of all along. If you get one of those, and this is something that the groups might not cope well with, you go, right, fine, we don't need to think about that one anymore. It's cool, it's excellent. If it comes up, we're rolling in clover. but actually there is no risk mitigation to be done here. There is no challenge. So we can just cut it out and spend our time on the bad worlds. And you can also cut out things where, in effect, they're strong extensions of the existing system, or the policy happens to fit well, even though the world is perhaps not where you might want to be. So if you go back down to slide 9 now, the one with the 2 no entry signs on it.
Yep.
Yep, okay. So in my example, in a high-tech, high-trust world, fundamentally we could just ditch the whole thing because the particular policy I was thinking about had no basis for operation. So you needed to know if it was coming, but your immediate thought was, if this world comes, basically our policy is going to die on the vine. We just don't need it anymore, and we spend the resources somewhere else. That's something you need a bit of pre-warning of, but actually it comes fairly naturally. So we cut that one. We didn't think about it too hard. And the Blade Runner world, for want of a better phrase, was one where actually the policy worked even better than intended. It would have been an absolutely hideous world to live in, but the policy was pretty much designed for it, which possibly gives you some insight into the brains of Home Office policymakers. I'm not sure I'm quite going there. So those 2 worlds we could cut out of the system completely and focus our thinking, our planning around Apple World and Gin Lane. So if I go back up to slide 6 again, I promise I've nearly finished with it, Nomsa.
No problem.
The last stage is to explore how we would know whether one of these worlds came up. And the example I always use in these cases, so I'm sorry, but he's heard it before, but I like it, is that when I was chatting to a bunch of people in an entirely different context, they were saying that back in the 70s, when people were rioting, the police would keep half an eye on people's doorsteps, because if all the milk bottles in an area went missing, it was odds on that the milk bottles were being taken to make Molotov cocktails with. And it was a really good leading indicator for a while of where people might riot. And that really is the kind of thing that you're looking at in this next stage. How would we know if something was going to go horribly wrong before it actually went? What are the tipping points? What are the things that might be indicators that we've got a problem here? So now if we go back up to slide 5.
Yeah.
And this is kind of where you might tie on other OR approaches, which is why I've sort of listed a few. So, there's loads of MI approaches that might start to get you to what are leading indicators of things going horribly wrong. Once you've got your ideas of what leading indicators might be, you can plug them into dashboards and tracking systems and cut-offs of various sorts that start to trigger you to look at things, so that you can more or less automate some of the early warning stuff. And that's something OR people are really good at, of course, and that, again, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs over. And then you can go in for other exploratory approaches. So you might say, okay, well, this is the thing that we want to predict. How does it fit into a system more generally? If I use systems thinking, how can I work out what else it affects? And therefore how I might see sort of slightly offbeat leading indicators. You can run modelling for how much you need to worry about particular things, and that's quite a useful thing to do. It stops it from becoming so totally challenged that it becomes all doom and gloom. And I'm back again with the red teaming. Once you've got your new world, getting people in a separate workshop in a more serious way to focus on how they'd game your system in that world is really quite a good source of leading indicators. And then having got those and having thought about the impact on your policy, you start to get people to think through mitigation strategies, and often perfectly sensibly policy colleagues want to go away and do that themselves. That's not something you have to build OR into. It's something you could build OR into, but it's not a necessary part of this process. And then I've talked a little bit about, using different ways of embedding these kinds of things into people's thinking and into people's lives. But for example, I know back when they were developing contests, they had a series of scenarios that they tested every single thing in that strategy against. So the embedding of what happens in this world, what happens if this thing happens, do we need to worry about this thing, into people's brains is perhaps the most useful part of the exercise of all. And that's the end of that slide. Are there any questions up to here?
Do we have any questions? Please feel free to use the questions box or the chat box to ask those questions. No questions as yet, so we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, I'm running horribly short here, I'm sorry. So the last slide is just, I guess, the example again. I haven't put most of the leading indicators in for, again, what I hope are obvious reasons. But one obvious one was, what's the availability of technology? What's the cost of technology? How walled garden is it versus how open source? And then the second was around social media and the extent to which there were crossovers between different groups, or social media groups were tending to fragment and create a kind of bubble effect. And both of those things, with some help from other colleagues, we did manage to find sort of sensible, useful indicators around that people were, I hope I've left since then, able to use in some sort of sensible way. That's pretty much the end of the slide. I've put a few other examples. There's a particularly nice one that I hadn't seen before I was doing the research for this article about Jerusalem and terrorism in Jerusalem and what they do for different groups. But I've just put a few examples and a few bits of further reading in the very last slide. So, thank you for listening. Have you any more questions?
Thank you very much, Hiroko, for a really informative presentation there. If anyone's got any other questions, please feel free to use the questions and the chat box, which are on that right-hand panel. Okay, so we have another question from Ian Mitchell, and he asks, does a policy profession know about wind tunneling?
As is usually the case with OR, bits of it certainly do. So, for example, the Cabinet Office's Horizon Scanning Centre certainly knows about it. And it's one of the things that the policy profession in a couple of my previous departments used to sell as a good idea. But I suspect, like all OR things, it could be better promoted.
Right, great. Thank you for that. Do you have any more questions? We've still got a bit of time until the end of this webinar. We've got a question from Daniel Arthur, and he says, in what form do you undertake systems thinking as mentioned in the previous slide?
In what form? So I have seen it best done as a workshop exercise again. I've also had people, I've worked with colleagues who've used pre-existing systems models or built theoretical systems models in a purely analytical way, and then used them to help policymakers think through questions in arising as a result of wind tunneling, or in how policies might interact. Is that answering the question? I'm not quite sure what the direction of the question was. So if you want something different or something more there. I don't think it's a particularly software dependent thing, if that's what the question was aimed at.
Oh, Daniel just expanded a little bit more and asked, was it diagrammatic rather, or mainly verbal?
Oh, sorry. So diagrammatic. I don't think I've ever seen anybody do a verbal form of systems thinking, but I'd love to, if you have, I'd love to hear about that. That sounds absolutely fascinating.
Great, thank you. Do we have any more questions? I think that means that your presentation was super informative, and everything was quite clear. So thank you once again to Hiroko for a really great presentation. Just for information, we will be sending around the slides, so you can have a copy of those. And this webinar has also been recorded, so you can actually watch that on demand from our website. I'll be emailing around the slides and the link to the recording by tomorrow. And yes, I think we're all good here. A bit shorter than anticipated, but I think we're pretty much done. And for some of the attendees that had issues with accessing the webinar as well, they'll have all that available to them.
Thanks ever so. If I'll stick a slide at the end of the pack and send it back to you with my email address, and then if anyone wants to get in touch, they're very welcome.
Perfect, that sounds great. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for actually attending as well. We have another webinar next month. So these happen every first Wednesday of every month. So please feel free to go on our website and register to attend that webinar as well. And those details will also be included in the follow-up email. All right, perfect. Thank you everyone, and hope you have a great day. Bye now.